The black maid's baby crawled into the Korean Mafia boss's office, and then into his heart. Kang Ji-hoon was the kind of man who made grown men weep with a single glance. A Korean Mafia boss so ruthless that his name alone could silence a room full of hardened criminals. His empire stretched across 3 continents, built on blood, betrayal, and an iron will that had never once faltered. He trusted no one. He needed no one. And he certainly had no room in his cold, calculated world for weakness of any kind. But on one fateful night, everything changed. Ji-hoon stepped into his private office, a fortress within a fortress, protected by biometric locks, armed guards, and security systems that could detect a fly landing on the windowsill. He was exhausted, his mind heavy with the weight of a business deal that had just collapsed in spectacular fashion, threatening to unravel years of carefully laid plans. As he moved toward his leather chair, seeking even a moment of solitude in his empire of shadows, he heard it. A soft, innocent sound that had no business existing in his world. Coo! Ji-hoon froze mid-step, his body tensing like a predator sensing danger. The sound came again, clearer this time, drifting from his inner chamber, a room so private that even his most trusted lieutenants had never set foot inside. His hand instinctively moved toward the gun holstered beneath his jacket as he approached the door, every muscle coiled and ready. He pushed the door open, and what he saw made absolutely no sense. In the center of his Persian carpet, surrounded by priceless artifacts and documents worth millions, sat a baby. A tiny, chubby-cheeked baby with dark skin that gleamed like polished mahogany in the lamplight, wearing nothing but a simple onesie decorated with little yellow ducks. The baby looked up at him with eyes full of innocent wonder, smiled the brightest smile he'd ever seen, and reached out tiny hands as if she'd been waiting for him her entire life. Ji-hoon's world, built on certainty, control, and carefully calculated moves, shattered in that single moment. Because somehow, impossibly, this baby had appeared in the one place on Earth that should have been absolutely impenetrable. And as Ji-hoon stared into those trusting eyes, he couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't a coincidence. That this tiny intruder had arrived at exactly the moment when his empire was crumbling, when he was more vulnerable than he'd been in 20 years. But who sent her? And why? Before we dive deeper into this story that will challenge everything you think you know about family, fate, and the power of innocent love to transform even the darkest heart, this is Beth's Library, where unexpected encounters change destinies and where the most unlikely bonds become unbreakable. Yet if you are ready to discover how a ruthless mafia boss's carefully controlled world was turned upside down by a crawling baby with an impossible gift, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because you won't want to miss a single moment of this journey. And if this story touches your heart, share it with someone who needs to believe in the power of second chances. Now, settle in, because what happened next would change not just one life, but 3 lives forever. Kang Ji-hoon stood frozen in the doorway of his inner chamber, his rational mind struggling to process the impossible scene before him. The baby, because yes, it was definitely a real, living, breathing baby, sat contentedly on his carpet, completely unbothered by the confusion radiating from the most dangerous man in Seoul. What the hell? The words escaped his lips before he could stop them, though some deeply buried instinct made him soften the curse, made him remember that there were rules about language around children, rules his own mother had beaten into him decades ago. The baby responded with another cheerful, "Agoo," and proceeded to grab a loose thread from his $15,000 carpet, tugging at it with the kind of focused determination usually reserved for corporate takeovers. Ji-hoon's eye twitched. "Stop that," he commanded in the same tone he used to order executions. The baby ignored him completely, yanked the thread free, and examined it with the fascination of a jeweler studying a rare diamond. "You just ruined my carpet," Ji-hoon said slowly, as if explaining the concept might somehow reverse the damage. The baby looked up, smiled wider, and offered him the thread like it was the most precious gift in the world. Something utterly foreign stirred in Ji-hoon's chest, something uncomfortable and unwelcome that felt suspiciously like amusement. He crushed it immediately. He was Kang Ji-hoon. He'd ordered the execution of men for far less than property damage. He'd burned down entire businesses for disrespect. He didn't find vandalism adorable. Except apparently he did when it came in a package this small. Ji-hoon's mind raced through possibilities, each more ridiculous than the last. Had one of his enemies planted the baby here as some kind of twisted message? Was this an elaborate blackmail scheme? His thoughts turned darker. Had one of the women from his past, and there had been many, though none he'd cared enough about to remember, somehow gotten pregnant and decided to leave this child as some kind of claim on his empire? The idea was absurd on multiple levels. His security was impenetrable. His lawyers made every woman he'd ever been with sign ironclad agreements. And besides, the timeline didn't add up. This baby looked to be maybe 6 or 7 months old. And Ji-hoon distinctly remembered his last relationship ending over a year ago, a forgettable affair with a forgettable woman whose name he'd already forgotten. He stepped closer, studying the baby with the same intensity he used to analyze business contracts and criminal enterprises. The baby had skin several shades darker than any woman he'd ever been involved with. Her features were distinctly African, with full cheeks, a broad nose, and thick curly hair that stood up in tiny puffs all over her head. "You're not mine," he said aloud, as if the baby might confirm or deny the accusation. "Agoo," the baby responded enthusiastically, waving the thread like a victory flag. "Right, obviously." Ji-hoon found himself crouching down, his expensive suit stretching across his shoulders as he lowered himself to the baby's level. "So, that still doesn't answer the question of how you got in here." The baby seemed to consider this, her expression remarkably serious for someone who couldn't possibly understand a word he was saying. Then she did something that made Ji-hoon's breath catch. She reached out and patted his cheek with one tiny, impossibly soft hand. The touch was gentle, trusting, completely devoid of the fear that usually characterized people's interactions with him. In that moment, Ji-hoon realized something profound and terrifying. This baby had no idea who he was. She didn't know about the bodies he'd buried, the empires he'd crushed, the enemies he'd destroyed. To her, he was just a man, just another human being worth smiling at. It was the most honest interaction he'd had in 20 years. "You're fearless," he murmured, and despite everything, his lips curved into something that might have been a smile. "Probably stupid, but fearless." The baby grabbed another thread from his carpet. Ji-hoon laughed, actually laughed, a sound so foreign to his own ears that it startled him. "Oh, so you're just going to systematically destroy my office? Is that the plan?" He settled fully onto the floor, his back against the wall, his $1,000 suit pants creasing against the carpet. "I could have you arrested for breaking and entering, destruction of property, trespassing in a restricted area." "Agoo. You make a compelling argument," Ji-hoon conceded, his voice taking on a tone he'd never heard himself use before, warm, playful, almost tender. "The carpet is old. I've been meaning to replace it anyway." For the next few minutes, they simply existed together in that strange bubble of impossible peace. The baby explored and Ji-hoon watched, and somewhere in the back of his mind, alarm bells were screaming that this was wrong, that he needed to call security, that he needed to figure out how this breach had happened and eliminate everyone responsible with extreme prejudice. But he didn't move. Because for the first time in longer than he could remember, the weight of his empire, the burden of his choices, the constant vigilance required to stay alive in his world, all of it faded into background noise. There was just him and this baby, who had somehow, impossibly, found her way into the one place he thought was safe. "You remind me of someone," Ji-hoon said softly, though he couldn't quite place who. The baby looked offended, her little face scrunching up in indignation. "Oh, you think you're unique? One of a kind?" Ji-hoon's smile widened. "Fine. You're absolutely right. I've never met anyone quite like you." The baby seemed satisfied with this answer and went back to her systematic destruction of his carpet. Ji-hoon checked his watch, a Patek Philippe worth more than most people made in a year, and realized with a start that he'd been sitting on the floor with a strange baby for over 15 minutes. 15 minutes during which the Hanseong deal was still collapsing, his enemies were still circling, and his empire was still teetering on the edge of a disaster he didn't fully understand yet. And yet, he couldn't bring himself to care. "All right, little vandal," he said, standing and brushing off his pants. "I can't leave you here, and I certainly can't leave you on the floor destroying priceless antiques." He held out his hands. "Come on." The baby looked at his hands, looked at him, and promptly raised her arms in the universal gesture of a child wanting to be picked up. Something in Ji-hoon's chest cracked open, just a hairline fracture, barely noticeable, but there nonetheless. He bent down and scooped up the baby, surprised by how light she was, how perfectly she seemed to fit against his chest, her head tucking naturally into the curve of his shoulder. She smelled like baby powder and something sweet he couldn't identify, a scent so fundamentally innocent that it seemed to purify the air around them. "This is insane," Ji-hoon muttered, carrying her back into his main office. "Absolutely insane." The baby responded by grabbing a fistful of his silk tie and yanking hard. "Hey!" He gently pried her fingers loose. "This tie costs more than—" He stopped himself, realizing the absurdity of explaining haute couture to an infant. "Never mind, where do you want to sit?" The baby pointed decisively at his chair. A massive leather throne positioned behind a desk made from a single piece of Brazilian walnut, the seat from which he'd ordered countless operations that had shaped the criminal underworld of 3 continents. Ji-hoon stared at her. "You have expensive taste, I'll give you that." He set her down on the chair, and she immediately bounced, delighted by the way the leather cushioned her. Then she started exploring, her tiny hands patting the armrests, pushing at the documents stacked on his desk, reaching for the crystal paperweight that held down his most confidential files. "No, that's—" Ji-hoon moved the paperweight out of reach. "That's not a toy." The baby looked disappointed, but quickly found something else to occupy her attention: the buttons on his desk phone, which she began pressing with gleeful abandon. Ji-hoon should have stopped her, should have removed her from his chair, called security, demanded answers. But instead, he found himself watching, fascinated by the way she approached the world with such fearless curiosity, such absolute confidence that everything she encountered was placed there specifically for her entertainment. Minutes stretched into a quarter hour, then half an hour. Ji-hoon's phone buzzed repeatedly with urgent messages about Hansong, about the leaked documents, about the government investigation that was picking up steam. He ignored every single one. Because in this moment, watching this tiny intruder explore his office like it was a playground designed just for her, Kang Ji-hoon forgot about empires and enemies and the carefully constructed walls that had kept him alive but utterly alone for 2 decades. And that's when his office door burst open. The young woman who rushed in was clearly in distress. Her maid's uniform slightly disheveled, her dark skin glistening with perspiration, her eyes wide with panic. She was beautiful in an understated way: high cheekbones, full lips, natural hair pulled back into a professional bun. Those strands had escaped to frame her face. But what struck Ji-hoon most was the raw fear in her eyes as they landed on the baby. "Rose." The woman's voice cracked with relief and terror mixed in equal measure. She rushed forward, her hands reaching for the baby. "Oh my God, Rose, I've been looking everywhere for you." The baby, apparently named Rose, squealed in recognition. "Agoo!" The woman scooped Rose into her arms, crushing her against her chest with the fierce protectiveness of a mother bear. "I'm so sorry," she gasped, still not looking at Ji-hoon, her attention focused entirely on the baby in her arms. "I put her down for just a second, and she just learned how to crawl. And I didn't think she could move so fast, and this is entirely my fault. I take full responsibility." She was babbling now, words tumbling out in a panicked rush as she checked Rose over for injuries, her hands gentle but thorough. Only when she was satisfied that her baby was unharmed did she finally look up at the man standing before her. And the blood drained from her face. "Oh my God," she whispered, recognition and horror flooding her features in equal measure. She'd clearly heard the stories, seen the photos in the briefings all staff received about the man who owned this estate. You're Chairman Kang?" Ji-hoon studied her with the same intensity he brought to interrogating informants. The uniform marked her as one of the cleaning staff, though he made it a point never to interact with the hired help. His estate manager handled all of that. He paid well, demanded discretion, and expected invisibility. Apparently, his standards were slipping. "And you are?" His voice carried none of the warmth he'd used with the baby. This was his business voice, cold and commanding, the tone that made subordinates straighten their spines and choose their words very carefully. My name is Amara Williams." Her voice shook, but she held his gaze with more courage than most of his lieutenants could manage. "I'm part of the housekeeping staff. I work the night shift in the West Wing. Rose is my daughter, and I am so sorry for this intrusion. I'll leave immediately, and if you want to fire me, I completely understand." "How old is she?" Ji-hoon interrupted. Amara blinked, clearly not expecting the question. She's 7 months old." "And you bring your baby to work?" It wasn't an accusation, just a question. though Ji-hoon could imagine the circumstances that would force a woman to make such a choice. Childcare was expensive, single mothers, and he was already certain she was single based on the absence of a ring and the desperate edge to her fear, often had no good options. I have no one else to watch her, Amara admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. My regular sitter fell through tonight and I couldn't afford to miss another shift, and I thought I could keep her in the break room while I worked, but she learned to crawl today and Her voice broke. I'm sorry. I know that's not an excuse. Rose, apparently bored with the serious adult conversation, began to squirm in her mother's arms. Her little face scrunched up, and then she started to cry. A sound so heartbreaking that it cut through Ji-hoon's carefully maintained emotional distance like a hot knife through butter. But she wasn't crying because she was scared or hurt. She was reaching for Ji-hoon, her tiny hands grasping at the air between them, her eyes locked on him with an intensity that seemed impossible for someone so small. No, Rose, please. Amara tried to soothe her, rocking her gently. But the baby's cries only grew louder, more insistent. Ji-hoon found himself stepping forward before he'd consciously made the decision to move. Let me, he said, and held out his arms. Amara stared at him like he'd just suggested they rob a bank together. Sir? I couldn't possibly— She wants me, Ji-hoon stated simply, because it was obvious, and because something in him needed to hold this baby again, needed to feel that pure, uncomplicated trust that asked for nothing but presence. Hesitantly, clearly terrified she was making a terrible mistake, Amara transferred Rose into his arms. The baby stopped crying immediately. She settled against his chest with a contented sigh, grabbed his tie again, and smiled up at him like he was the best thing she'd ever seen. Well, Ji-hoon said softly, looking down at the tiny face that seemed convinced he was someone worth trusting. That's settled then. Amara looked like she might faint. Sir, I don't understand. What do you know about me, Amara Williams? Ji-hoon asked, his eyes still on Rose. Amara swallowed hard. I know you're the chairman of Kang Enterprises. I know this estate is private, and the staff are instructed to maintain absolute discretion about everything we see or hear. I know that you value privacy above almost everything else. And what did they tell you about my other business interests? He looked up at her now, his gaze sharp, assessing. Amara's hands twisted together. They told us not to ask questions, not to talk about our work to anyone outside the estate, that loyalty and silence would be rewarded, and anything else would be— She trailed off, clearly not wanting to finish the sentence. Would be dealt with severely, Ji-hoon completed for her. Yes, that's accurate. He stroked Rose's back absently, feeling her relax further against him. So you understand that bringing your child into my private office, allowing her to access areas that are supposed to be secured, represents a significant security breach. Tears formed in Amara's eyes. Please, she whispered. Please don't hurt her. Whatever you need to do to me, I accept. But please don't hurt my baby. The plea struck Ji-hoon harder than he expected. In his world, people begged for their lives all the time. He'd heard every variation of desperate pleas, empty promises, and last-minute bargains. He'd become immune to them, had trained himself to see them as tactical maneuvers rather than genuine expressions of human fear. But this was different. Amara wasn't begging for herself. She was begging for her child, and there was something so fundamentally pure about that sacrifice, so devoid of calculation or manipulation, that it reached past all of Ji-hoon's carefully constructed defenses. I'm not going to hurt anyone, he said quietly, and realized he meant it. Rose was keeping me company. I enjoyed it. Amara's mouth fell open slightly, confusion replacing fear. How did she get into my inner chamber? Ji-hoon asked, genuine curiosity in his voice now. I don't know, Amara admitted. I was cleaning one of the meeting rooms on this floor, and I set up her playpen in the corner like I always do. I turned away for maybe 2 minutes to dust the bookshelves, and when I looked back, she was gone. I've been searching for 20 minutes, checking every room I have access to. I never imagined she could have gotten in here. Ji-hoon looked down at Rose, who gazed back at him with an expression of pure innocence. Your daughter has a talent for getting past security systems. She must have crawled through an open door when someone else went in. All the doors to this wing require biometric authentication, Ji-hoon interrupted. They lock automatically. There are no open doors. Silence fell as both adults contemplated the impossibility of what had happened. Maybe there was a malfunction? Amara suggested weakly. My security systems don't malfunction. Ji-hoon had personally overseen their installation, had paid a fortune for technology that governments envied. And yet, here she is. Rose chose that moment to yawn, a jaw-cracking yawn that scrunched up her entire face. Then she burrowed deeper into Ji-hoon's chest, her eyelids drooping. She's tired, Amara said softly. It's past her bedtime. I should take her. Where do you live? Ji-hoon asked abruptly. Amara tensed. In the city, about 40 minutes from here by bus. You take a bus home? At night? With a baby? The last bus leaves at midnight, Amara said defensively. I usually make it. Ji-hoon's jaw tightened. The areas served by late-night buses in Seoul weren't known for their safety. The thought of this woman traveling alone with an infant through those neighborhoods made something protective flare in his chest, an emotion he ruthlessly suppressed. How much do I pay you? He asked. Amara named a figure that made Ji-hoon's eyes narrow. It was barely above minimum wage, nowhere near enough to support a child alone in one of the world's most expensive cities. That's unacceptable, he stated flatly. Sir, I'm grateful for the job. I'll have your salary doubled, effective immediately, and I'll arrange for a car service to take you home after your shifts. Amara stared at him like he'd started speaking in tongues. I can't accept that. You can. And you will. Ji-hoon's tone left no room for argument. Consider it compensation for Rose's companionship this evening. She helped me more than you know. Before Amara could respond, before Ji-hoon could second-guess the impulse that was driving him to make decisions that made no logical sense, a smell hit his nostrils. Unmistakable, unpleasant, and entirely biological. Rose had apparently chosen this moment to demonstrate a different kind of talent. Ji-hoon's nose wrinkled. What is that? Despite her confusion and fear, despite the completely surreal nature of this entire encounter, Amara laughed. A bright, genuine sound that transformed her face from merely beautiful to absolutely radiant. That, she said, is a dirty diaper. Welcome to parenthood. Ji-hoon immediately held Rose out toward her mother. Right. Yes. You should probably take her now. Amara accepted her daughter, still smiling, though Ji-hoon could see the bewilderment in her eyes. The 1,000 questions she wanted to ask, but didn't dare voice. Rose, however, had other ideas. The moment her mother's arms closed around her, she began to fuss, reaching back toward Ji-hoon with increasing distress. Shh, baby, it's okay, Amara murmured, swaying gently. Let's get you changed and then we can go home. Pa, Rose said clearly, her eyes locked on Ji-hoon. Everyone froze. She's never said that before, Amara whispered, her face flushing. I swear, she doesn't usually. But Rose was insistent now, straining in her mother's arms, repeating the syllable with increasing volume. Messa, pa, pa. Ji-hoon felt something shift inside his chest, that hairline crack widening into something more substantial, something that might become a chasm if he wasn't careful. Take her home, he said, his voice rougher than he intended. Get her cleaned up and put to bed. Report to my office tomorrow at 9 a.m. We need to discuss your employment situation. Amara's eyes widened with new fear. Sir, please, I need this job. I'm not firing you, Ji-hoon interrupted, perhaps more harshly than necessary. Tomorrow, 9 a.m. Don't be late. He turned away before he could see Rose's face. Before he could hear another pay that would shake foundations he'd thought were unshakable. He walked to his window, presenting his back to them both. His hands clasped behind him in a posture of dismissal. He heard Amara's soft footsteps, the quiet click of his office door closing, and then silence. Ji-hoon stood at the window for a long time, staring out at the Seoul skyline, at the empire he'd built from blood and brutality. His phone buzzed again. More bad news about Han-seong, more problems that required his immediate attention, more threats to the carefully constructed world he'd spent 2 decades creating. He ignored all of it, because his mind was full of soft baby sounds and tiny hands that trusted him without reason, full of a woman's desperate love for her child and the way she'd laughed despite her fear, full of impossible questions about locked doors and perfect timing and a single syllable that shouldn't have mattered, but somehow did. Pa. Ji-hoon pressed his forehead against the cool glass and allowed himself one moment of weakness, one moment to acknowledge the truth he'd been running from his entire adult life. He was so desperately, achingly alone. And for just a little while tonight, holding that baby in his arms, He hadn't been. The next morning, Kang Ji-hoon woke at 5 a.m. as he always did, went through his usual routine of exercise and meditation, and tried to convince himself that last night had been an aberration, a moment of weakness brought on by stress, and the shock of discovering an intruder in his inner sanctum. By 8:55 a.m., he'd almost succeeded in relegating the entire incident to the category of strange but ultimately meaningless. Then, Amara Williams walked into his office at precisely 9 o'clock, carrying Rose in her arms, and Ji-hoon's carefully reconstructed emotional walls crumbled like sand castles before a tsunami. "Good morning, Chairman Kang," Amara said formally, though her voice trembled slightly. She'd clearly taken great care with her appearance. Her hair was styled in neat braids, her uniform was crisp and clean, and she carried herself with as much dignity as someone could while holding a squirming baby. "You asked me to meet with you." Rose saw Ji-hoon and immediately began bouncing in her mother's arms, her face splitting into a grin so wide it seemed to encompass her entire being. "Pa! Pa!" Ji-hoon felt his carefully prepared speech dissolve into nothing. "She's still doing that." "I tried to correct her," Amara said quickly, apologetically. "But she's stubborn. She's been saying it all morning, every time I show her your picture." She stopped abruptly, her eyes widening as she realized what she'd just admitted. "You showed her my picture?" Ji-hoon's eyebrows rose. Amara's cheeks darkened with embarrassment. Yes. I thought maybe if she could see that you weren't actually her father, she might stop, but she just got more excited." Despite himself, Ji-hoon smiled. "Come in. Sit down." Amara hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the informality, but she obeyed, settling into one of the leather chairs across from his desk while keeping a firm grip on Rose. Rose, however, had no intention of sitting quietly. She immediately lunged toward the desk, her arms reaching for Ji-hoon with single-minded determination. "Rose, no," Amara chided gently, trying to pull her back. "It's fine." Ji-hoon stood and walked around his desk. Without overthinking it, without analyzing the impulse, he held out his arms. Rose practically threw herself at him, and he caught her automatically, settling her against his hip with an ease that surprised them both. "You're a natural," Amara said softly, wonder in her voice. Ji-hoon looked down at the baby who was now contentedly playing with his collar, her tiny fingers fascinated by the texture of his expensive shirt. "I've never held a baby before yesterday." "Really?" Amara sounded genuinely shocked. "You look like you've been doing it your whole life." They stood there for a moment in awkward silence, both acutely aware of how bizarre this situation was. Here was one of the most powerful men in Korea, known for his ruthlessness and his carefully maintained distance from anything resembling normal human connection, holding a maid's baby like it was the most natural thing in the world. "I did some research last night," Ji-hoon said finally, breaking the silence. "On you." Amara's face went pale. "Sir, I can explain. Your daughter's father was Park Min-jun. He died 8 months ago, drowning in debt from gambling addiction. His family disowned you when they discovered you weren't legally married, despite the fact that you were pregnant with his child. Your own family." He paused, seeing the pain flash across her face. "Your own family disapproved of your relationship with a Korean man and cut you off when you refused to end it." Amara's hands clenched in her lap. "I didn't realize my personal history was relevant to my employment." "It's relevant to what I'm about to propose," Ji-hoon said quietly. He moved to sit on the edge of his desk, still holding Rose, who had now discovered that his watch made interesting clicking sounds when she pressed the buttons. "You're living in one of the worst neighborhoods in Seoul in a studio apartment that barely meets safety codes. You work 60-hour weeks and still can't afford proper childcare. You're one emergency away from complete financial ruin." Tears formed in Amara's eyes, but she blinked them back fiercely. "I'm doing my best." "I know you are." Ji-hoon's voice softened. "But your best shouldn't have to be this hard." "What are you proposing?" Amara asked warily. Ji-hoon took a breath, preparing to say something he'd never imagined saying to anyone. "There's a guest house on my estate, 3 bedrooms, fully furnished with its own kitchen and living area. It's been empty for years. I want you and Rose to move in." Amara's mouth fell open. What? No, I couldn't possibly. You'd continue your work here, but your salary would be adjusted to reflect your new role." "What new role?" "Estate manager." Ji-hoon watched her face carefully. "You'd oversee the household staff, manage the property, coordinate security protocols. It's a significant increase in responsibility, but I believe you're capable. Sir, I clean toilets. I have no management experience. You're raising a child alone in a foreign country, while working 60 hours a week and somehow managing to smile through it all? If that doesn't demonstrate management skills, I don't know what does. Ji-hoon shifted Rose to his other hip as she began to squirm. The position comes with a salary increase to reflect the new responsibilities, plus housing, health insurance, and a generous education fund for Rose. Amara was shaking her head now, tears streaming freely down her face. This doesn't make sense. Why would you do this for us? You don't even know us. Ji-hoon looked down at Rose, who had abandoned his watch in favor of trying to eat his shirt collar. I told you last night that Rose helped me. I meant it. She's a baby. She can't help anyone. You'd be surprised. Ji-hoon's lips curved into a small smile. I was dealing with a business crisis when she appeared. A deal that's been collapsing all week, taking significant parts of my empire down with it. I've been so focused on trying to salvage it that I couldn't see clearly anymore, but spending time with Rose... He paused, searching for words to explain something he barely understood himself. She gave me perspective, reminded me what actually matters. And what matters? Amara whispered. Ji-hoon met her eyes directly. Not being alone. The vulnerability in his voice, the raw honesty of the admission, seemed to crack something open in Amara's chest. She saw him clearly for the first time, not as the terrifying crime boss whose reputation preceded him. Not as the wealthy chairman who controlled an empire, but as a man who'd built walls so high he'd forgotten what it felt like to let anyone in. I don't understand you, she said softly. I don't understand me either right now, Ji-hoon admitted. But I do know this. Rose got into my inner chamber through locks that are supposed to be unpickable. She appeared at exactly the moment when I was questioning everything I've built. She looked at me like I was someone worth trusting, and I can't remember the last time anyone did that. He stood, carrying Rose over to where Amara sat. I'm not asking you to understand, I'm asking you to accept help. For her, if not for yourself. Amara looked at her daughter, who was happily nestled against this dangerous man's chest like she'd found the safest harbor in the world. And she thought about the moldy walls of their studio apartment, the broken lock on their door, the nights she'd stayed awake listening to arguments and violence in the hallways, praying Rose would sleep through it all. What do you get out of this? She asked, needing to understand the transaction, needing to know what price would eventually be demanded. Ji-hoon seemed to consider the question seriously. Time with Rose, he said finally. I'd like to spend time with her. Not every day, not in any way that interferes with your parenting. But when I need to remember what it feels like to be human, I'd like the option. It was perhaps the strangest employment negotiation in the history of strange employment negotiations. But Amara, looking at the desperate loneliness in this powerful man's eyes, realized that he was offering her a lifeline while asking for one in return. Okay, she whispered. Okay, we'll do it. Ji-hoon's shoulders relaxed, tension draining from them that she hadn't even noticed was there. Good. You can move in this weekend. I'll have my people handle everything. I can pack my own things. Let them help. You've been doing everything alone for too long. He looked down at Rose, who had started to doze off against his shoulder. She's falling asleep. She usually naps around this time. Amara stood, preparing to take her daughter back. But Ji-hoon shook his head. Let her sleep. I have a video conference in 10 minutes, but she can stay, unless you need to. No, Amara trailed off, looking at her baby sleeping peacefully against this man's expensive shirt, drool already forming a small wet spot on the fabric. Are you sure? Absolutely certain. Ji-hoon walked back to his chair and sat down carefully, adjusting Rose so she was comfortable. You can pick her up after the conference. My secretary will let you know when we're done. Amara nodded slowly and moved toward the door. She paused at the threshold, looking back at the sight of the notorious Kang Ji-hoon holding her baby with a gentleness she wouldn't have believed possible. Chairman Kang. Ji-hoon, he corrected softly. When it's just us, you can call me Ji-hoon. Ji-hoon? She tested the name, feeling strange intimacy in the syllables. Thank you. For everything. He met her eyes, and for just a moment his carefully controlled expression cracked, revealing something raw and grateful underneath. Thank you for letting me help. After Amara left, Ji-hoon sat in his office, holding a sleeping baby, waiting for his video conference to begin. His executives appeared on screen right on schedule. 20 serious men in serious suits, ready to discuss serious business. They all froze when they saw Rose. "Sir," his CFO began carefully, his eyes fixed on the baby. Is this an appropriate time for the meeting?" "Perfect timing," Ji-hoon replied calmly. "Proceed with your report." The CFO cleared his throat and began presenting the disastrous numbers from the Hanseong deal. Revenue losses in the tens of millions, contract violations that could lead to lawsuits, government scrutiny that threatened to expose activities that really couldn't afford exposure. Throughout it all, Rose slept peacefully against Ji-hoon's chest, her tiny breaths warm against his neck. "We need to make a decision," the CFO concluded. "Plan A is to cut our losses and walk away. We'd take a significant hit, but we'd avoid further complications. Plan B involves doubling down through a third-party consulting firm that's offered to help navigate the government restrictions. They claim they can get us back on track within 6 months." "Who's the consulting firm?" Ji-hoon asked. "Mirai Solutions. They specialize in exactly these kinds of situations. They've already drawn up preliminary contracts." "Agu?" Every executive on screen blinked in unison as Rose stirred, her small voice cutting through the business discussion like a bell. Ji-hoon looked down at her. Rose's eyes had opened halfway, still drowsy with sleep, but focused intently on the laptop screen, as if she could see the men on the other side. "Send me both proposals," Ji-hoon said, his attention now split between the baby and the executives. "The complete contracts, not summaries. I want every page, every clause." "Sir, with respect, Plan A is clearly the safer option," the CFO began. "Agu!" Rose's voice was louder now, more insistent. The executives stared at the baby like she'd just started speaking in tongues. Ji-hoon's eyes narrowed as he studied Rose's face. She was fully awake now, and there was something in her expression, something focused and almost urgent, that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. "Send me both proposals," he repeated, his voice leaving no room for argument. "We'll reconvene tomorrow after I've had time to review them personally." After the meeting ended, Ji-hoon looked down at Rose, who was now wide awake and playing with his fingers. "Did you just save me from making a terrible decision?" he asked her. Rose smiled and said, "Agu," in a tone that sounded remarkably like "obviously." Ji-hoon laughed, the sound echoing in his empty office. "All right then, little advisor. Let's see what we're dealing with." He spent the next 3 hours reading contracts while Rose played on a blanket he'd had his secretary spread on the floor. She was remarkably content, amusing herself with toys that had been hastily purchased from the nearest store, occasionally looking up to make sure he was still there. And as Ji-hoon read, the pieces began to fall into place. Plan B wasn't just risky, it was a trap. Mirai Solutions had ties to a competitor who'd been trying to edge into his territory for years. The contract was filled with clauses that would give them access to his internal operations, his trade secrets, his entire network. If he signed it, he'd basically be handing his empire to his enemies on a silver platter. Plan A, while painful in the short term, would preserve his independence and his power base. It was the smart play, the safe play, the play a 7-month-old baby had somehow known to choose. Ji-hoon set down the contracts and looked at Rose, who was currently attempting to fit her entire fist in her mouth. "How did you know?" he asked softly. Rose pulled her fist out long enough to say, "Agu," then went back to her important work. "Right, silly question." When Amara came to collect Rose an hour later, Ji-hoon was sitting on the floor beside her, helping her stack blocks that she immediately knocked down with gleeful abandon. "How was the conference?" Amara asked, taking in the surreal scene. "Productive," Ji-hoon replied, standing and brushing off his pants. "Your daughter may have just saved my company." Amara laughed, thinking he was joking, but Ji-hoon's expression was completely serious. "I'll explain later," he said. "Right now, I have some calls to make. Can you bring Rose by tomorrow morning? Same time? You want her to come back?" Amara couldn't keep the surprise out of her voice. "Every morning, if that's all right with you. I find her presence clarifying." And so began the strangest routine in the history of corporate leadership. Every morning at 9 a.m., Amara would bring Rose to Ji-hoon's office. He would hold strategy meetings, review contracts, and make decisions that affected millions of lives, all with a baby on his lap, or playing nearby. His executives gradually got used to it, though they never quite lost their bewilderment at seeing their ruthless chairman cooing at an infant between discussions of market manipulation and hostile takeovers. The changes in Ji-hoon were subtle at first. He smiled more. He listened more carefully. When executives presented plans that would hurt innocent people, he found himself thinking of Rose and asking questions he'd never bothered with before. Who else gets affected by this? What happens to the employees? Are their families involved? His reputation evolved from merciless to merciless but somehow more human, which confused his enemies and comforted his allies in equal measure. But the most significant change was simpler. Kang Ji-hoon, who had spent 20 years perfecting the art of being alone, was alone no longer. 3 weeks after Rose first crawled into his office, Ji-hoon found himself doing something he'd sworn he'd never do. Attending a business lunch with a baby strapped to his chest in a carrier. His security team had nearly had collective heart attacks when he announced his intention, but he'd overruled their objections with the kind of finality that ended discussions. Now he sat in one of Seoul's most exclusive restaurants, surrounded by executives who were trying very hard to pretend that it was completely normal for their chairman to be wearing an infant like an accessory. Rose, for her part, was fascinated by the fancy silverware and kept trying to grab the butter knife. No, Ji-hoon said gently, moving it out of reach for the 4th time. That's not for playing. Agoo, Rose protested. His lunch companion, a Japanese investor named Tanaka who controlled significant shipping interests, watched this interaction with barely concealed amusement. I apologize for the unconventional meeting conditions, Ji-hoon said, finally managing to interest Rose in a cloth napkin instead of cutlery. Not at all, Tanaka replied smoothly. Though I admit I'm curious. The Kang Ji-hoon I've heard about doesn't strike me as the type to bring PBs to business meetings. People change, Ji-hoon said simply. Indeed. Tanaka took a sip of his wine, his eyes shrewd. And is this change related to the rumors I've been hearing? Ji-hoon's expression didn't change, but his body tensed imperceptibly. What rumors? That you've been making different choices lately. Turning down deals that would have been profitable but ethically questionable. Asking questions about worker welfare and environmental impact. One of my contacts said you actually increased wages at one of your factories without being forced to by labor action. Tanaka leaned forward. That doesn't sound like the man who built an empire on ruthless efficiency. Ji-hoon looked down at Rose, who had abandoned the napkin in favor of trying to grab his tie. Perhaps I've been reminded that empires built on ruthlessness tend to collapse eventually. Better to build something that lasts. Wise words. Tanaka studied him carefully. Your father would be proud. The mention of his father made Ji-hoon's chest tighten. My father built his empire on loyalty and honor. I inherited the empire but forgot those foundations. I'm trying to remember them now. Because of a baby? There was no mockery in Tanaka's voice, just genuine curiosity. Because of what a baby represents. Ji-hoon corrected. Hope. Trust. The possibility that people can be better than their worst impulses. He smiled slightly. She sees me as someone worth trusting. I'd like to become the person she thinks I am. Tanaka nodded slowly, seeming to come to some internal decision. Then I think we can do business, Kang Ji-hoon. The shipping contracts I'm offering, I'll be honest. I was planning to drive a very hard bargain, but a man who's trying to be worthy of a child's trust, that's someone I'd rather have as a partner than an adversary. They shook hands, and Ji-hoon realized that Rose had just helped him secure a deal worth hundreds of millions, simply by existing, by making him want to be better. As they left the restaurant, Ji-hoon's head of security fell into step beside him. Sir, I need to report something. Ji-hoon shifted Rose to his other shoulder, where she was happily chewing on his collar. What is it? We've been investigating how the baby got into your inner chamber that first night. The security footage shows something unusual. Show me. Back at his estate, they reviewed the footage together. And what Ji-hoon saw made no logical sense. The video clearly showed Rose crawling down the hallway toward his office. But every time she approached a locked door, the lock would disengage just before she reached it, not because she'd somehow triggered the biometric sensors, which was impossible for a baby who wasn't in the system, but because the lock seemed to simply open, as if they recognized that she needed to pass through. It's like the building wanted her to find you, the security chief said, clearly uncomfortable with how mystical that sounded. Ji-hoon watched the footage 3 more times, each viewing deepening his conviction that Rose's appearance in his life had been anything but coincidental. Increase security on Amara and Rose, he ordered. Discreet protection? Nothing that would alarm them, but I want to know they're safe at all times. Yes, sir. Should I try to find an explanation for the lock malfunction? Ji-hoon looked at Rose, who was sleeping peacefully in his arms, oblivious to the mysteries surrounding her. Some things don't need explanation. They just need to be accepted. That night, alone in his office after Amara had taken Rose home to the guest house they'd moved into over the weekend, Ji-hoon stood at his window and thought about fate and timing and the strange ways the universe sometimes intervened in human lives. His empire was more stable now than it had been in months. The Hansong disaster had been minimized by walking away rather than doubling down. The Tanaka deal would open new markets. His employees were happier, more productive, more loyal, because he'd started treating them like people rather than resources. And all of it, every positive change, every better choice, could be traced back to a single moment when a baby had appeared in a locked room and smiled at him like he was worth saving. "Thank you," he whispered to the empty air, not quite sure who he was thanking. The universe? Fate? Rose herself? Maybe it didn't matter. Maybe the only thing that mattered was that he'd been given a second chance to build something meaningful, and he was finally taking it. The weeks turned into months, and the relationship between Ji-hoon, Amara, and Rose evolved into something that looked remarkably like a family, though none of them had quite put that label on it yet. Ji-hoon found himself arranging his schedule around Rose's nap times. He learned the difference between her hungry cry and her tired cry, and her "I'm bored and need attention" cry. He became an expert at changing diapers, making bottles, and singing lullabies in a combination of Korean and English that probably horrified linguists, but delighted Rose. Amara, for her part, slowly began to trust that this arrangement was real, that Ji-hoon wasn't going to suddenly take everything away. She watched the way he looked at her daughter, with a softness that seemed completely at odds with his reputation, and felt her own heart beginning to open in ways she'd thought were impossible after Minjun's death and her family's rejection. She started joining them for lunch sometimes, sitting in Ji-hoon's office while Rose napped, talking about everything and nothing. They discovered they both loved classical music, that they'd both lost their mothers young, that they both carried wounds from families who'd failed to love them the way they'd deserved. "My father wanted me to be like him," Ji-hoon confessed one afternoon, watching Rose sleep in her portable crib. Strong, ruthless, untouchable. "He taught me that emotions were weaknesses to be eliminated, that trust was a liability, that the only thing that mattered was power." "Did you believe him?" Amara asked softly. "For 20 years. Yes." Ji-hoon's voice was quiet, reflective. "I built an empire on those principles. I became exactly what he wanted me to be." "And now?" "Now I think he was wrong." Ji-hoon looked at Amara, his dark eyes intense. "Power means nothing if you're alone. Success means nothing if there's no one to share it with. My father died rich and feared and completely isolated. I was determined not to repeat his mistakes, so I isolated myself even more thoroughly." He smiled sadly. "It took a 7-month-old breaking into my office to show me how stupid that was." Amara reached across the space between them and took his hand, the first time she'd initiated physical contact. "You're not stupid, you're just learning." Ji-hoon looked down at their joined hands, marveling at how natural it felt. "What about you? What are you learning?" "That it's okay to accept help, that being strong doesn't mean doing everything alone, that not all men are like Minjun or my father." She squeezed his hand gently. "That some people actually mean it when they offer kindness." They sat like that for a long moment, holding hands in comfortable silence while Rose slept, both of them aware that something was shifting between them, something that went beyond employer and employee, beyond co-parents to a child who belonged to only one of them. "Amara," Ji-hoon said finally, his voice rough with emotion, "I need to tell you something." "What?" "I'm falling in love with your daughter." Amara's breath caught. "I know. And I think—" He paused, gathering courage. "I think I might be falling in love with you, too." The confession hung in the air between them, vulnerable and terrifying and beautiful. Amara's eyes filled with tears. "Ji-hoon, we can't. This is all happening so fast, and I just got out of such a terrible situation, and I don't want to make another mistake." "I know." He brought her hand to his lips, kissing her knuckles gently. "I'm not asking for anything, I'm just being honest. You can do whatever you want with that information. Stay, leave, tell me to back off. I'll respect whatever you decide. But I couldn't keep lying to myself about what this is becoming." "What is it becoming?" Amara whispered. "Family," Ji-hoon said simply. "It's becoming family." And there it was, the word neither of them had dared to speak, hanging in the air like a promise and a question all at once. Amara stood, and Ji-hoon's heart sank, certain she was about to walk away. But instead, she moved around the desk and stood in front of him. Then, slowly, carefully, she leaned down and pressed her lips to his forehead. "I'm not ready," she said softly, "but I'm also not running away. Can we just take it slow?" Ji-hoon closed his eyes, overwhelmed with relief. "As slow as you need." "Okay." She smiled, her hand cupping his cheek. "Okay." Rose chose that moment to wake up, her cheerful agoo breaking the tender moment. But as Ji-hoon stood to pick her up, as Amara laughed and wiped her tears, as the three of them stood together in the afternoon sunlight streaming through his office window, he thought that maybe this strange, impossible, beautiful thing they were building together might be worth more than all the empires in the world. 6 months passed, and Ji-hoon's transformation became the talk of Seoul's business community. The ruthless Kang Ji-hoon was apparently raising a baby, had promoted a black woman to his highest level of household management, and was making business decisions that prioritized long-term stability over short-term profit. His enemies didn't know what to make of it. His allies were cautiously optimistic. His board of directors was confused, but couldn't argue with results. The company was more profitable than ever, with better employee retention, stronger international relationships, and a reputation that was shifting from terrifying to tough but fair. And through it all, Rose continued to demonstrate her uncanny ability to influence his decisions. She would fuss when contracts contained hidden dangers. She would laugh during meetings with trustworthy partners. She would fall asleep during presentations from people who were lying, as if she couldn't bear to be conscious during dishonesty. Ji-hoon stopped questioning it. He simply accepted that Rose had a gift, and he learned to trust it the way he'd never trusted anyone before. But the real test came on a cold November evening when everything nearly fell apart. Ji-hoon was working late, reviewing acquisition papers, when his head of security burst into his office without knocking, a breach of protocol that immediately put him on high alert. "Sir, there's been an incident." Ji-hoon was on his feet in an instant. "What kind of incident?" "Amara's ex-boyfriend's family. They're claiming Rose was conceived during their son's marriage to another woman. They're demanding custody, saying Amara was a mistress who trapped their son. That's a lie." Ji-hoon's voice could have cut glass. "I know, sir. But they have lawyers, and they're making noise in the press. They're saying that a single foreign woman with no family support shouldn't be raising a Korean child, that Rose should be with her real family. I'll destroy them." The words came out cold and final. "Sir, they're prepared for that. They have connections to Judge Kim, and you know he's been looking for an excuse to come after you for years. If you make this a war, they'll drag it through courts, drag Amara's name through the mud, possibly even tie up Rose in custody proceedings for months." Ji-hoon felt rage and fear warring in his chest, rage at these people who would use a baby as a weapon, fear that he might lose Rose and Amara just when he'd finally found them. "There has to be a way," he said quietly. His security chief hesitated. "There is one option. If Amara were married, specifically, married to a Korean citizen with impeccable credentials, their claim would have no legal standing. The child would be protected by the marriage." The implication hung in the air. "Get out," Ji-hoon said softly. After the man left, Ji-hoon stood alone in his office, his mind racing. Marriage. He could marry Amara, and Rose would be legally protected. The ex-boyfriend's family would have no claim, but it would be a marriage of convenience, built on legal necessity rather than love, and Amara had asked for time, had asked to take things slow. Proposing now, under these circumstances, would take away her choice, would make it impossible for her to say no without risking her daughter. It would be a betrayal of everything he'd promised her, and yet, if he did nothing, he might lose them both. Ji-hoon was still wrestling with this impossible decision when his office door opened and Amara walked in, carrying a sleeping Rose. Her face was streaked with tears, her usual composure completely shattered. "They called me," she said, her voice breaking. "Min-jun's parents. They said terrible things. They said I was a whore who seduced their son, that I was using Rose to extort money from them, that they were going to take her away and give her to a proper Korean family who could raise her correctly." Ji-hoon was across the room in 3 strides, pulling both of them into his arms. "I won't let that happen. How can you stop them? They have money, lawyers, connections. So do I." Ji-hoon's voice was steel. "And unlike them, I actually love this child. I'll do whatever it takes to protect her." Amara pulled back slightly. looking up at him with red-rimmed eyes. What can you do? This was it. The moment of choice. He could propose. Could solve this with a marriage certificate and legal protections. But it would poison everything they'd been building. Would turn their relationship into a transaction instead of a choice. Or he could trust her. Trust that together, they could find another way. I don't know yet, he admitted. But I promise you, I will figure it out. You're not alone in this, Amara. Not anymore. She pressed her face against his chest, rose between them, and let herself cry, for the first time since Minjun's death, letting someone else carry some of her burden. And as Ji-hoon held them both, feeling Rose's soft breaths and Amara's tears, he made a vow to whatever forces had brought them together. He would protect this family, whatever it took, even if it meant using every dark skill he'd spent 20 years perfecting. The next morning, Ji-hoon made a call to someone he'd sworn never to contact again, his older brother, Kang Ji-woo. They'd been estranged for 15 years, ever since Ji-hoon had taken control of the family business and Ji-woo had walked away, disgusted by the criminal elements their father had woven into legitimate enterprises. Ji-woo had become a family law attorney, one of the best in Korea, known for taking on powerful families who tried to exploit legal loopholes. "This is unexpected," Ji-woo said when he answered the phone. His voice was cool, professional, giving away nothing. "I need your help," Ji-hoon said, and those words, admitting weakness, admitting need, cost him more than he would ever admit. "With what?" Ji-hoon explained the situation. Rose, Amara, the ex-boyfriend's family, their custody threat. He left nothing out, including his own feelings for both mother and daughter. Ji-woo was silent for a long moment after Ji-hoon finished. "So the ruthless Kang Ji-hoon has found a heart. I never thought I'd see it. Can you help or not?" "I can help, but I have conditions." "Name them." "First, you stop paying the judges, stop the bribes, the blackmail, all of it. If I'm going to represent you, it will be in a legitimate court following legitimate procedures." Ji-hoon's jaw tightened. "That puts me at a disadvantage. That puts you on the right side of the law, which is where you need to be if you want to protect this child long term. You can't build a family on the same foundation you built your empire. It won't work." The words hit Ji-hoon like a physical blow because he knew they were true. "What else?" "Second, you clean up your business. Really clean it up. I know you've been making changes, but it's not enough. You want to be a father to this baby? Then be someone she can be proud of. Not someone she'll have to make excuses for when she's old enough to understand who you really are. That could take years. Then you'd better start now." Ji-woo's voice softened slightly. "Look, I know what Dad did to us. I know how he taught you that the only way to survive was to be harder, colder, more ruthless than everyone else. But you have a chance to break that cycle. Don't waste it." Ji-hoon closed his eyes, feeling the weight of his brother's words, the truth in them. "I'll do it. Both conditions. Now help me protect my family." "Our family?" Ji-woo corrected gently. "If I'm helping you, that makes them my family too. Which means Rose gets an uncle, and Amara gets a brother-in-law who's actually decent." Despite everything, Ji-hoon smiled. "She'll like you better than me." "Probably. I'm much more charming." Ji-woo's tone turned serious again. "Send me all the documentation you have. I'll file a preemptive response to their custody claim, and I'll request an expedited hearing. We'll argue that their claim is baseless, motivated by shame rather than concern for the child's welfare. With your resources and Amara's clear devotion to Rose, we have a strong case. And if we lose, we won't lose. Not if you're willing to do what needs to be done." "What's that?" "Tell the truth. Show the judge who you really are now, not who you used to be. Bring Rose to the hearing. Let them see what you've become because of her." It was terrifying advice, being vulnerable in court, exposing his changes and his feelings to legal scrutiny. But Ji-hoon had learned from Rose that sometimes the bravest thing you could do was trust. "Okay," he said. "I'll do it." The custody hearing took place 3 weeks later in a Seoul family court. Ji-hoon wore a simple black suit instead of his usual power attire. Amara sat beside him, holding Rose, her face a mask of controlled terror. Across the aisle sat Minjun's parents, an older couple wearing traditional Korean clothing and expressions of righteous indignation. Judge Kim presided, his face impassive as he reviewed the case files. He was known for his conservative views on family structure and his skepticism of foreigners raising Korean children. Ji-hoon's history with him made the situation even more precarious. Ji-woo stood to present their case, and Ji-hoon was reminded why his brother was considered one of the best attorneys in Korea. Your Honor, this case is fundamentally about a deceased man's parents attempting to exert control over a child they've shown no interest in until she became associated with wealth and stability. Park Min-joon abandoned Ms. Williams when she was pregnant, died deeply in debt, and his parents refused any contact or support when she reached out after his death. They have no relationship with his child. They've provided no financial support, no emotional connection, no presence in her life whatsoever. And yet they claim Ms. Williams was a mistress who trapped their son, Judge Kim said neutrally. A claim contradicted by every piece of evidence we've provided. Min-joon and Ms. Williams were in a committed relationship for 2 years. His parents disapproved because Ms. Williams is Black and American, not because she was somehow immoral. Their son chose not to marry her because he was afraid of his parents' reaction, not because there was another wife. One of the opposing lawyers stood. The Parks simply want to ensure their granddaughter is raised in a proper Korean household, with Korean values and cultural understanding. She's being raised in a Korean household, Ji-woo interrupted smoothly. Ms. Williams works as the estate manager for my brother's property. She and her daughter live on the grounds, are immersed in Korean culture daily, and Rose is learning both Korean and English. More importantly, Ms. Williams has provided stable, loving care for her daughter, while the Parks have provided nothing. Your Honor, the Parks lawyer said, we're concerned about Ms. Williams' ability to provide for this child long term. She's a single foreign woman with no family support, working in domestic service. She's employed in a management position with a generous salary, full benefits, and housing provided. Ji-woo corrected. She has more stability than many two-parent households. Judge Kim looked at Ji-hoon directly. Mr. Kang, you've been notably silent during these proceedings. What is your interest in this case? Ji-hoon stood slowly. This was the moment Ji-woo had prepared him for, the moment of vulnerability that went against every instinct he'd honed over 20 years. Rose saved my life, Your Honor. The courtroom went silent. 6 months ago, I was a man who'd built an empire on ruthlessness and isolation. I trusted no one. I cared for nothing except power. And I was miserable in ways I didn't even recognize, because I'd been miserable for so long. Ji-hoon's voice was steady, honest, stripped of all artifice. Then one night, a baby somehow got past all my security and appeared in my office. She looked at me like I was worth trusting, like I was someone who deserved love, and everything I thought I knew about myself crumbled. He looked at Rose, who was watching him with those impossibly wise eyes. She didn't just change my business decisions, though she did that too. Her instincts have saved my company millions. She changed me. She made me want to be better, to build something meaningful instead of just something powerful. She gave me back my humanity. Mr. Kang, Judge Kim said carefully, are you claiming that an infant has been advising you on business matters? I'm claiming that an infant has better instincts than most of my executives. Yes, but more than that, I'm claiming that she's part of my family now. I love her like she's my own daughter. And I love her mother. He looked at Amara, saw tears streaming down her face. So my interest in this case is simple. I will not let anyone hurt my family. You're not married to Ms. Williams, Judge Kim pointed out. Not yet, Ji-hoon said quietly. But I intend to be, if she'll have me. Amara's eyes widened in shock. So this is about legitimizing a romantic relationship? The Parks lawyer jumped in. Your Honor, this proves our point. Ms. Williams is using her daughter to secure a wealthy husband. Or, Ji-woo said coldly, my brother is doing what the Parks never did, stepping up to provide for a child who needs protection and love. Unlike the Parks, who've shown interest only after discovering Rose's connection to wealth, Mr. Kang has been present in Rose's life for months, providing financial support, emotional care, and stability. Judge Kim studied the case files for a long moment. Then he looked at Rose, who chose that exact moment to reach toward Ji-hoon, calling, Pa! Pa! Bring the child forward, Judge Kim ordered. Amara stood on shaking legs and carried Rose to the judge's bench. Ji-hoon followed, positioning himself beside them. Judge Kim looked at Rose carefully. Hello, little one. Rose smiled at him, then immediately turned and reached for Ji-hoon again. Pa! She calls you father, Judge Kim observed. Yes, Your Honor. She has since the beginning. And does she have a relationship with her biological grandparents? No, Your Honor, Amara said quietly. They've never met her. Never asked to meet her. Judge Kim looked at the Parks. Is this true? Minjun's mother stood, her face flushed. We didn't know about her until recently. Ms. Williams sent you multiple messages after your son's death, informing you of his daughter's birth and asking for support. Jiwoo interjected. We have the message receipts. The Parks lawyer scrambled. Our clients were grieving. For 6 months? Judge Kim's tone was sharp. You couldn't find time in 6 months to meet your granddaughter. But you can file for custody when you discover she's connected to one of Korea's wealthiest families? The courtroom fell silent. Judge Kim looked at Rose one more time. The baby was settled happily in Ji-hoon's arms, playing with his tie, completely at peace. Then the judge looked at the Parks, sitting stiffly in their traditional clothes. Strangers to this child they claimed to want. I'm denying the Parks' petition for custody, Judge Kim announced. Furthermore, I'm issuing a restraining order preventing them from contact with the minor child unless Ms. Williams explicitly permits it. This court finds no evidence of Ms. Williams being unfit and substantial evidence that the child is thriving in her current environment. Minjun's mother gasped. Their lawyer started to object. My decision is final, Judge Kim said firmly. However, I do have concerns about the long-term stability of this arrangement. He looked at Ji-hoon. Mr. Kang, you mentioned an intention to marry Miss Williams. Is that a genuine commitment or a legal strategy? Ji-hoon met the judge's eyes directly. It's both, Your Honor. I would marry Amara tomorrow if she'd agree, because I love her and I love her daughter. But I also recognize that marriage would provide additional legal protection for Rose. I see no contradiction in those motivations. Ms. Williams, Judge Kim addressed Amara directly. You've been quiet during most of these proceedings. What do you want? Amara looked at Rose, then at Ji-hoon, then back at the judge. I want what's best for my daughter, Your Honor. I want her to grow up knowing she's loved, protected, and valued. I want her to have opportunities I could never give her alone. And I want. She paused, gathering courage. I want her to have a father who looks at her the way Mr. Kang does, like she's the most precious thing in the world. And Mr. Kang's proposal? Amara turned to Ji-hoon, her eyes searching his face. I need to know it's real, that it's not just about protecting Rose. Ji-hoon handed Rose to Jiwoo, who accepted his niece with surprising ease. Then he took both of Amara's hands in his. We really apologize, but we're gonna have to stop here. We'll work on part 2 as soon as possible. If you want the second part, kindly tell us in the comments section. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next part.